The Cross Disability Efforts Project is a project funded by the Pennsylvania Developmental Disabilities Council, and it was really meant to promote cross-disability thinking in Pennsylvania. The primary focus of the project was doing forums around the state and all over the state, where people from the disability community came together to discuss different points of view, different perspectives around disability and cross-disability thinking.
My personal reasons that I'd love to see cross-disability work continue on a large-scale basis is the sheer numbers. You know, people with disabilities are the minority group that cuts across every minority. And we are such a large number of people. And if we truly banded together on some common goals, I don't know if you could stop us.
We tend to gravitate toward people like us, who gravitate toward organizations with missions and visions that speak to our vision, maybe our specific disability. And I think that's what sometimes segments us as an overall cross-disability community.
If you go back to 1965, the Mental Retardation Bill of Rights, as it was called then, that bill started the movement or started the disability system that we have today. And that kept funding pretty strict, I believe, some of the individuality and some of the reasons why disabilities kept themselves separate because of the funding.
It was Amy who spoke about the power of our community in just sheer numbers. And I think anytime that we speak together, we speak with a louder voice. We're more likely to be heard.
These conversations that were had at the forum were very powerful in the fact that it brought people together to really learn from each other, to learn from their different perspectives and to gain knowledge from those different perspectives.
For me, the answer is something to do with the fact that the definition of disability is not something created by disability, but is actually created by the community in which we live. It is the dominant culture that defines disability, and our commonality is oppression by the dominant culture rather than anything that we have physically in common.
To me, disability is not so much about the person per se, but how the attributes of the person are affected by the environment, both the physical environment, the social environment, and then, and part of the social environment is, of course, other people.
Our disability doesn't control us, we just do things a little bit differently than everyone else.
We can do, the same things that, anyone else can do. We just have to, adapt, certain things.
There are medical terms for disability, but I tend to think of it as, something that people bring to the situation and how the situation affects them.
I think part of it is the disability itself. They see themselves unique from each other. A person on the spectrum, Asperger's syndrome or significant autism, sees themselves different than an individual with intellectual disabilities as someone with a learning disability. So I think they see themselves so diverse, so different, and they don't see the commonalities that they all share, that has created that, that silo effect. I think we can change that though.
If we all live long enough, chances are we ourselves are going to experience some disability.
We really wanted a wide variety of perspectives, so not only did we meet in the forums for group thought and discussion, we ended up meeting with people on an individual basis in their homes, in their professional offices, to truly get those perspectives and ideas around cross-disability thinking.
For me, growing up with cerebral palsy was, I guess hindsight being 20/20, almost a non-issue, until I became more self-aware about having pride as a person with a disability. For so long, my mom, who was my biggest advocate, kind of told me and encouraged me to just live my life and be a kid.
One of the psychologists told me that when he goes into middle school, he's probably going to need like psychological support because he probably won't have any friends. And I asked him if he ever spent 2 minutes with Everett, because he would clearly see that's not at all the case. I think people set limits for people with disabilities because they don't know what they don't know.
People like to stare at me. They like to look at me. People tend to speak really, really loud to me. I guess because they assume that I'm a wheelchair user, that I also might be a person who's deaf. I can either be upset about it or I can use it to make change.
Probably the biggest misconception is that there is no joy. Currently, my son Everett is married, owns a home, has a wonderful career.
And a wonderful family. And I honestly wouldn't change any of it for the world. And I think so many people assume that life with a disability must be awful. And it is the absolute best. I wouldn't change a thing of it for the world.
I would encourage all people who encounter people with disabilities to try to turn off that judgment when you meet them. It's hard to do it, but it's better to do it, because then you're going to think about the person as a person and you're not going to focus on the disability so much.
Some people pity, and that's completely unnecessary. There's nothing to be sorry for here. But for the most part, I think they get a very positive reaction.
I'm Kevin Fisk, and my wife is Kristen Snyder Fisk. Mark and Matt Snyder are her uncles.
Coffin-Lowry syndrome is, it's a broad syndrome. It has a lot of varying degrees. They're often mistaken for Down syndrome because they have some similar characteristics, but it's totally different. It's very rare. The biggest misconception I think people have about Mark and Matt is that they don't necessarily understand what's going on around them. Mark and Matt have trouble communicating, but we realize that they pick up on everything. And, you don't need to talk to them like they're a baby. They're not. Again, they might have trouble communicating to you, but they hear what you're saying, and they understand relationships, and they understand people.
The Mark and Matt understand more than they can communicate. So people, because they speak in usually 1, 2, 3 word phrases, and they assume that they, need to repeat themselves over and over or talk like they're talking to a 2-year-old.
Then we have 2 children who are almost 6 and 4. I talked to Zoe about the fact that there will be people with disabilities at her school, I think I said. And I said it would be like, when Mark and Matt were in school. And she looked at me, she goes, "What's wrong with Mark and Matt?" And she didn't understand it. She's now starting to get it. But this was Mark and Matt. They live in our house. This is who we are. So, a lot of people look at us and think, oh my gosh, it must be so stressful. We have probably more fun than many families do. We have more laughing going on than many families do, and a lot of that has to do with Mark and Matt.
We threw some hard questions at these groups like, how do we identify our commonalities while embracing our differences?
I think a lot of things that we talked about as far as identifying commonalities, we're having, the like settings like this, where people are coming together with and without disabilities and finding out, we're not so different from one another.
If we were able to lean into that difference and explore it, that would, I think, allow us to then focus more on commonalities and connections.
On the one hand, I think we do need to focus on issues that we all share, because we all have them, and in many ways we are more alike than different. But I think it really is important, like you just said, that knowing the differences and knowing each other's battles and struggles can only empower us to work together.
We tend to miss the nuances and the wonderful aspects difference can bring to community. So I'm not even just talking about disability, I'm talking about socioeconomic, I'm talking about different genders and different races and cultures. I mean, we often see how wonderful of an opportunity and event can be if we bring in cross-cultural, share everybody's food or experience everybody's beliefs or religion or whatever the case might be.
We asked people what they thought needed to be done to make further progress.
I think that, speaking toward education, we never educate young people about the power that we have as a group.
Do this learning early on in a kid's education, because that's where I think you have to catch them.
Children with disabilities should be able to attend public schools that can address their particular needs, and that non-disabled children, non-disabled students, should meet, interact with, and learn from children with disabilities?
I think that the teachers need to have some type of staff development so they can learn about the different disabilities, because I see that as a problem, and I think that would be instrumental if they had more teachers that were more aware of all the disabilities.
If people aren't exposed to it, how can you expect people to understand it? And I think when kids have other kids in their schools with any type of disability or difference and are exposed and celebrated rather than hidden, I think that's important. I think the more they grow up like that, the more they understand and the less it becomes an issue.
Having these type of conversations again opens the door to kind of new ideas. It opens the door to educating, to sharing, and to see again all of our similarities instead of looking at our differences. When we talk about starting with the youth, I think it's an excellent idea, but those youth live in communities. And they live within their cultures, and they live within their spirituality, and they live within their religion. So there are many ways to do this kind of cross-disability work. There's not just going to be one way.
And I'll be very blunt, I think our politicians need education. When we have people who are making decisions about, legislation and decisions about what kind of education our students will receive, or how much funding people with disability or funding goes to services and to our states, without really knowing who they're funding or what they're supporting, I think they need the primary form of education. One letter gets sent to a politician, they can ignore it. 2 letters, well, they might look at it, but when they get 5, 10, 15 letters, then they have to pay attention to it, and then they have to respond. Well, if it's only one disability, well, people can ignore that. If it's 2 and 3 and maybe more, and maybe come together, well, then people have to pay attention. People have to acknowledge, and maybe things can, there's other things that can be done.
In the end, this was just one project, but for true change, the conversation needs to continue.